Senator from Alabama.
Asked unanimous consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you. Madam President, in the winter of 2010, American intelligence picked up the chatter of Afghan fighters in Pakistan. Why are you back? Asked the Taliban leaders. You're supposed to be fighting the Americans. Yes, one of the fighters said, but the Americans run towards the bullets. That story captures the American fighting spirit. If you ever find yourself questioning the greatness of this country, I encourage you to go talk to one of our young service members. I'm not talking about our older generals or war horses you often see on TV or around here in Capitol Hill. They won't renew your faith in America. They may even worry you. I'm talking about the young people. It's the door kickers, the tank drivers, the trigger pullers. Some of them are still just kids. I'm talking about the ones fresh out of college, ones hoping to pay for college by signing up for our great military. These young people are America's future. They are the Americans who fought so hard for us in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. And they are the ones so disappointed today of how we abandoned our mission in Afghanistan. Many of them did not remember the bright blue morning on September 11, 2001, when evil itself boarded 4 planes here on the East Coast and took the lives of 2,977 of our fellow Americans in just a matter of hours. They were just infants when President Bush demanded the Taliban hand over Osama bin Laden and shut down the terrorist training camps that littered Afghanistan. And when the Taliban refused, the United States and our most loyal ally, Great Britain, invaded Afghanistan. We were soon joined by 46 other nations. It was the first time Article 5 of NATO had been invoked, which states an attack on one is attack on us all. America, in her righteous might, launched Operation Enduring Freedom and rained hell on the Taliban on October the 7th, 2001. We lost 12 brave American soldiers. But by December the 17th, we controlled a country few Americans could have found on the map months before. To call Afghanistan in 2001 Stone Age would be an insult to the rocks on the ground. We saw diseases only found in textbooks. 85% of the population was illiterate. No girls were allowed to attend school. Cell phones and computers were non-existent. We were not there to conquer. We didn't want to nation build. Our presence was needed because we wanted to keep Afghanistan from, yet again, becoming a training sanctuary for every would-be terrorist on earth. After all, the United States and our politicians of the 1990s looked the other way and failed to recognize Afghanistan as a threat. 30 years ago, Afghanistan was a training ground for some 20 to 30 terrorist groups. From Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda attacked the World Trade Center in 1993, 2 of our embassies in Africa, and a bombed USS Cole, a ship that was docked. The Clinton administration thought it could handle Al-Qaeda and their terrorist threat with over-the-horizon capabilities. September 11th showed us that strategy doesn't work. But unfortunately, the Biden administration has forgotten those lessons of our past. During World War II, my father landed at Normandy and fought the Nazis in Europe. Hitler and Germany had the will to win, but thank God, America and our allies had more will. From the time my dad landed at Normandy to when he reached Berlin, he earned 5 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. He was lucky. More than 400,000 of our Americans would never return home. Their blood, sweat, and tears saved Europe and the free world. Yet the work of the greatest generation didn't end on May the 8th, 1945. Americans stayed in Germany. We stayed to prosecute Nazi leadership. We stayed to build and rebuild their businesses and banks. If you drive a BMW today, it's because America worked to change the behavior of millions of Nazis who were still living in Germany after the war. And we are today still in Germany. It's the same success story in Japan and in South Korea. America's commitment to freedom and democracy didn't end when the shooting stopped. Today, Germany, Japan, and South Korea are some of our most vibrant economies and democracies across the world. Those nations are also among our closest allies. That, ladies and gentlemen, was our hope for Afghanistan. Every American wants to see war come to an end. War is ugly. War is brutal. War robs lives and destroys property. But freedom is certainly worth fighting for. Like World War II, our war in Afghanistan was completely justified. We took the fight to the enemy who started it, Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Our war in Afghanistan ended in 2014. Operation Enduring Freedom transitioned to a supporting role called Operation Resolute Support. That support trained the Afghan Army, intelligence, and police forces to fend for themselves. It allowed a greater educational opportunities for young boys and girls all throughout Afghanistan. And as the Afghan security forces became increasingly capable, America withdrew her forces. By January 2021, we'd reduced our presence to just 2,500 from a high of 98,000 in 2011. President Trump also wanted to go to 0, but his military advisors said it would be unwise. So President Trump listened and maintained troop levels at 2,500. President Biden claims he doesn't remember his generals telling him to keep 2,500 troops in Afghanistan. Yet the president's principal military advisor, General Mark Milley, says he wanted to see 2,500 troops in Afghanistan. The top commander for the Middle East, Frank McKenzie, said he wanted to see 2,500 troops remain in Afghanistan. The top longest-serving and most decorated commander in Afghanistan, General Scott Miller, wanted to see 2,500 troops in Afghanistan. That clearly told President Biden that to remain stable and protect the U.S. and our allies, Afghanistan needed small American presence of 2,500 troops. So when the president says he doesn't recall or he doesn't remember, is he telling the truth? Well, I don't know. But what I do know is that President Biden didn't listen to his military advisors. He didn't listen to troops on the ground. He ignored military advice and instead made a political decision. You can't run a war from Washington with an 8,000-mile screwdriver. If you do, you'll screw it up. 85 billion in equipment captured by the Taliban. Valuable air bases abandoned in the middle of the night. American citizens still left behind enemy lines to this day. Journalists and aid workers abandoned. Innocent Afghan partners and allies left to the will of our enemy. Chaos and disorder at Kabul airport. Desperate Afghans falling from our aircraft as people across our nation and the world watched in horror. 13 American soldiers dead. None of this should have ever happened. But now we must reckon with the worst foreign policy decision ever made. Our credibility has been eroded, and the respect from our allies has been destroyed. America must return to the peace through strength leadership that has guided us throughout history. It's made our enemies fear us, our allies value us, and what it means to have us as a partner on the world stage. Madam President, I notice the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Madam President. Are we currently in a quorum call?
Yes, we are.
I ask that we dispense with the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Many artists and entertainers have staked their claim to fame by bending the rules and changing the conventional wisdom that defines their craft. But not many can claim to have made an impact on American culture that is at once musical, political, and spiritual. This month, my friend and fellow Tennessean Lee Greenwood is enjoying some well-deserved recognition for doing just that. Next week, he will celebrate the 40th year of one of the most significant and successful careers in country music history. On behalf of the entire Tennessee delegation, I want to thank Lee for his artistry, his patriotism, his belief in the power of a song to heal our deepest wounds. We thank him for his friendship, for his commitment to our great state of Tennessee, and we wish him even greater successes in his career. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the remainder of my remarks be placed separately into the record.
Without objection.
Over the weekend, my Democratic colleagues put on a terrific show for the American people, arguing over which multi-trillion-dollar spending bill that they wanted to pass first. Not if they were going to pass one, which one they wanted to pass first. And from what I was hearing at home in Tennessee, they're saying, we don't want either of these. None of this should ever be passed and signed into law. Those that I spoke with also wanted me to pass on a message. Doesn't matter if they were Democrat, Republican, Independent, Libertarian. They said what happened here in Washington over the weekend was just about the most tone-deaf and disrespectful thing that they had seen take place in Washington in a long time. All year, Tennesseans have been asking themselves, why is it that the Democrats are pushing so hard to spend more than $1 trillion on a so-called infrastructure package that really isn't about infrastructure? Why are they fighting so hard for a multi-trillion-dollar social spending package that prioritizes all the wrong things? Tennesseans have caught on to this insanity. They know with absolute certainty that every time Joe Biden's government steps in to take control over an aspect of their lives, the goal is not to make their lives easier. The goal is to complicate their lives. The goal is to take away some of their individual freedom, some of their choice. There's no other explanation as to why they would do this in the face of some of the issues that we have, like serious supply chain vulnerabilities, unsustainable inflation, no, it is not temporary, and levels of divisiveness and mistrust that have made even the most unplugged, apolitical people that I know sit up and speak out. The fact that more people are paying attention is really a problem for my Democratic colleagues. They know that there's no chance that the majority of the American people will just go along with what it is that they are proposing. As I said, it doesn't matter if they're Democrat, Republican, Independent, Libertarian. They're looking at this and they're saying, hey, wait a minute, these guys that are over there, every one of them, what are they trying to do? They are trying to drive this socialist agenda, tear down our institutions, and build it back as a socialist state, which is exactly why the Democrats are opting for a power grab rather than an honest debate. By seizing that control and taking away that freedom, they're slowly but surely setting themselves up to redefine the relationship between the people and the government. Eventually, this will allow the Democrats to destroy our most important institutions and remake them in the image of the grand socialist future that they're so desperate to build. If you can't beat them, and the Democrats haven't been able to beat the people, then what do? They go about, the Democrats, and they just move the goalpost. They've shown this intent time and again over the course of decades, but let's start with more recent events. The federal health care takeover destroyed the concept of the doctor-patient relationship and replaced it with layers of bureaucracy and now rationing. Over the past 3 years, my Democratic colleagues have tried multiple times to force through an election takeover bill that would federalize voting. That is right, not local control like you have had, federalizing elections, intentionally expose conservative donors to an unhinged and violent opposition and make the ballot box vulnerable to fraud. That is what they're trying to do. Earlier this year, we discovered that the Democrats thought that opening up everyone's pocketbook for scrutiny by the IRS would be an acceptable way to pay for their so-called infrastructure package. It's a neat trick. It's also completely and utterly despicable. And people are not buying what the Democrats are selling. They do not want socialism ruling their life. They do not want the United States of America to be a socialist nation. The majority in this chamber have accused the Republicans in this chamber of many things, and most of them untrue. But what is true, that we are indeed getting in the way of this reckless, destructive agenda. That is because it is our duty to protect this country, to protect our freedoms. Joe Biden and the Democratic Party control the entire U.S. government. That's right. We had an election, and you're in charge. That government has already made it clear that mandate or no mandate, they have their eye on the prize. And that prize is to take away your freedom, give that over to the government, and leave you living in a socialist nation. All it will cost is all of your money, all of your principles, all of your freedom. That's right. That is the future that they, the Democratic Party, envision for you and your family. They, the Democratic Party, making all the decisions. They, the Democratic Party, winning all the elections because they federalize them and they let the federal government decide who wins, with them in charge. If the Democrats wish to make those sacrifices, they are more than welcome to go about trying to do it, because the American people are not buying the agenda that they are pushing. Every day I talk to Tennesseans. What they want? Freedom. Boundless freedom that allows them to experience their version of the American dream, that allows their children to dream big dreams and then live in a country where they can work to make those dreams come true. Preserving that is a worthy fight. I yield the floor. I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Senator from Kentucky,
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the quorum call.
without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the following interns in my office be given floor privileges until December 17th. Paris Nguyen and Seth Ricketts.
Without objection.
Madam President.
Senator from New Jersey.
Madam President, in May of this year, terrorist groups in Gaza launched more than 4,000 rockets at innocent Israelis. For 11 days, Hamas and others fired off thousands of various rocket systems with little guidance into heavily populated areas across Israel, with no regard indeed, likely with the intention of killing civilians. In the face of this barrage, once again, Israel deployed the Iron Dome missile defense system, which intercepted 90% of these incoming attacks. Because of this purely defensive system, Israel is able to protect its own citizens and also direct its response to more carefully target those in Gaza who are responsible for launching this brutal attack. Now, I have been clear. We should all mourn the loss of innocent Israeli and Palestinians who were killed during this conflict. Beyond a lack of regard for innocent Israeli civilians, Hamas further endangers Palestinians by hiding their stockpiles and themselves in densely populated areas. But I'm not here today to relitigate thousands of years of conflict. I'm here to point out two simple facts. Hamas as a terrorist organization that routinely threatens innocent civilians. Iron Dome, a purely defensive system that protects civilians. It saves lives regardless of religion or ethnicity, period. Furthermore, by saving those lives, Iron Dome also preserves diplomatic space for de-escalation, communication, and further negotiations about Israeli and Palestinian long-term security and the future of a negotiated two-state solution. There is no conceivable reason why anyone in this chamber on either side of the aisle should stand in the way of U.S. support for this life-saving defense to be fully ready for the next attack. I strongly urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join the House of Representatives in passing this funding on a broadly bipartisan effort. So therefore, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that at a time to be determined by the majority leader, following consultation with the Republican leader, the Senate proceed to the consideration of calendar number 140, H.R. 5323, that there be up to 2 hours for debate, that upon the use or yielding back of time, the bill be considered read a third time, and the Senate vote on passage of the bill without intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Madam Chairman, Madam President.
Senator from Kentucky.
Reserving the right to object, I join the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in being supportive of Iron Dome, but I think it should be paid for. I think the American taxpayer dollars that pay for it should come from money that could go to the Taliban. There's a fund with over $6 billion in it that was designated for the Afghan government, and that money, I think, could be spent on the Taliban if we do not rescind that money. The justification for my proposal for paying this is simple. Only an economically strong United States can be a militarily strong ally of Israel. I support Israel. I voted for hundreds of millions of dollars to support Iron Dome. I'm glad the United States has a strong bond with Israel. But the United States cannot give money it does not have, no matter how strong our relationship is. The United States is approaching $30 trillion in debt. Our out-of-control spending added $3 trillion to the debt just in this fiscal year. A day of reckoning is coming, sooner than you think. Interest on the debt will be larger than what we spend on national defense in just a few years. If the debt weakens us to the point where we have difficulty funding our own military needs, how can the United States continue to be a reliable ally to Israel? Getting our fiscal house in order does not mean that we are failing to support Israel. Far from it. The $1 billion under consideration today is on top of the more than $1.6 billion the U.S. has already given for Iron Dome, and that's not all. The U.S. provides Israel with just under $4 billion in aid annually. To date, the United States has provided over $146 billion in aid to Israel. In addition to Iron Dome, the U.S. has helped Israel fund other missile defense systems as well. We spent $2 billion on David's Sling and $3.7 billion on Arrow programs. That means the United States has contributed over $7 billion to Israel's missile defense system. Iron Dome is an indispensable defensive tool. That not only saves Israeli lives, but Palestinian lives. I want an Israel strong enough so that it does not have to rely on American support. But if we are here to add an additional $1 billion in aid, all I ask is that we make sure that it is paid for. My amendment would rescind $6 billion in Afghanistan reconstruction money that otherwise might go to the Taliban. Secretary Blinken said as recently as 2 weeks ago that this money may well go to the new Taliban government. Under this arrangement, we would devote $1 billion to Israel's Iron Dome and return the rest to Treasury. This is clear to all of the Republicans, so it needs to be very clear today that Republicans support paying for Iron Dome, and they support paying for Iron Dome with taking away money that would go to the Taliban. I hope my colleagues will work with me to strengthen Israel, strengthen the United States, and strengthen our alliance. I ask for unanimous consent that the senator modify his request so that instead of his proposal, the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar item number 140, H.R. 5323. Further, that the only amendment in order to be my substitute amendment, which is at the desk, I further ask that there be 2 hours of debate equally divided between the two leaders or their designees. Upon the use or yielding back of that time, the Paul substitute amendment at the desk be considered and agreed to. The bill as amended be considered read a third time, and the Senate vote on passage of the bill or as amended with no intervening action or debate.
Does the senator so modify his request?
Reserving the right to object. While I respect the senator from Kentucky's consistent approach to foreign aid spending, his substitute to H.R. 5323 is problematic for the following reasons. This amendment would unleash an array of adverse consequences for our broader foreign policy and national security objectives. This amendment ultimately proposes to rescind funds from the Departments of State and Defense. And this amendment would not reallocate funds that would allegedly go to the Taliban, as the senator from Kentucky suggests. The reality is that U.S. dollars are not going to the Taliban, nor will they. Let me be clear and echo what the administration has said. No U.S. foreign aid will go to a Taliban-controlled Afghan government. This does not mean that we remain any less committed to supporting the Afghan people. On the contrary, U.S. humanitarian aid could be routed through highly vetted partners like the World Food Program that we trust to put the interests of the Afghan people first. So let me be clear. Senator Paul's amendment would actually raid the funding that delivers life-saving humanitarian aid to the Afghan people, and they need it more than ever. Secondly, Afghanistan is in the grips of a dire humanitarian crisis. The economy has collapsed. 1 in 3 Afghans don't know where their next meal will come. People are afraid to leave their homes. And so, for those reasons, as well as the following, this amendment would also slash refugee assistance being used at this very moment to evacuate and resettle U.S. allies and partners who served alongside Americans in the war on terror. Likewise, Senator Paul is proposing we rescind the funding that supports important bipartisan priorities like promoting regional security, countering Chinese influence, and ending this pandemic. And that's not all. The amendment also jeopardizes funds being used to recover and secure U.S. military equipment. We may no longer be funding the Afghan National Army, but we still urgently need these repurposed funds to keep American equipment out of the wrong hands. In short, Senator Paul's amendment would undermine U.S. national security. It would abandon the Afghan people in their darkest hour, and it would betray the American people's commitment to supporting our Afghan allies. Finally, let me just say that this body overwhelmingly supports the swift passage of Iron Dome. Despite what others may have said, even on this floor, Democrats in the Senate are not holding up this critical funding. In the House, there may have been a very small handful of bipartisan opposition. And the only reason it's being held up in this body is because of this amendment. It is not a member of the Democratic caucus. This is a defensive, life-saving system built on years of cooperation with our ally Israel. I'm disappointed we're in this situation, but because of all of these reasons, I must object to the senator's substitute amendment.
Objection to the modification is heard.
Madam President.
Does object withdraw the request?
Madam
Is there
Pres-
objection to withdrawing the request?
Madam President, reserving the right to object, I think it is very clear and very important that it be very clear that I've offered to fully pay for the Iron Dome system with an extra $1 billion. The objection is coming from the Democrat side. They're objecting to it being paid for. We've offered this fund of $6 billion. We've offered to modify it and make it less, so there would still be some remaining money in this system. We've offered other funds. We've offered a basically open invitation to the other side that we just think it ought to be paid for. So the objection from the other side is to paying for Iron Dome, to paying for the $1 billion. Interestingly, aid is already going to Afghanistan while the Taliban is in charge. Now, allegedly, that aid is going to charitable organizations, but the history of the Taliban has been to withhold, control, manipulate, and corrupt charitable organizations as well. I think it's a mistake to have money already flowing into the new government under the Taliban and to charitable organizations, because it basically makes their job easier and will make the public more pacified if they're being fed by the Western world. They wouldn't be as happy if the money's being destroyed and it's chaos. So really, in some ways, you do help to stabilize the Taliban by sending more money into there. But Secretary Blinken was asked this very question in committee by myself. Can you guarantee that this $6 billion will not be released at any time to the Taliban? And he said no. The implication being that if the Taliban behaves, he sees this $6 billion going to the Taliban. I think it's a big mistake. This is a big issue. Iron Dome is a big issue, but it's also a big issue whether we send money to the Taliban. They already have $80 billion worth of our weapons. I think it would be a real big mistake to send money indirectly or directly to the Taliban, so I object.
The objection is heard.
Madam President,
Senator from New Jersey.
let me just simply say this is a fig leaf. We could have today passed Iron Dome, as the House of Representatives passed it, send $1 billion, and make sure that Israeli and Palestinians would be safer as a result of the terrifying actions that Hamas and others take. There is no reason for this. I know my colleague has not been particularly supportive on foreign aid in general, and in this case in particular, but the reality is that we have an opportunity here. Now, I'm convinced that Iron Dome will get done. We will get the resources to our ally, the State of Israel, but it's a shame that we have to have the uncertainty that is pending as a result of the objection that has been had. We don't need to find a pathway in this particular way, which, is only going to undermine our own national security interests as it relates to Afghanistan. With that, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Michigan.
Madam President, I request that I'm able to make my remarks prior to the vote.
Without objection.
Madam President, I rise in support of Jonathan Meyer's nomination to be General Counsel at the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS. Mr. Meyer understands the unique challenges facing DHS, and he has the legal and management experience and vision needed to succeed in this important role. Throughout the confirmation process, Mr. Meyer has demonstrated that he understands the complex legal issues facing DHS and the importance of ensuring the department cooperates with congressional oversight. DHS has not had a Senate-confirmed general counsel for over 2 years. DHS needs qualified, Senate-confirmed leaders in place to effectively carry out its critical mission of safeguarding our nation. Mr. Meyer is an accomplished lawyer and dedicated public servant who is well qualified to serve as the department's chief legal officer. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting the confirmation of Jonathan Meyer to be General Counsel for DHS. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session and resume consideration of the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, Department of Homeland Security, Jonathan Eugene Meyer of Ohio to be General Counsel.
Under the previous order, the question is on the nomination.
Under the previous order, the question is on the nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono.
I could go because you put your foot down. Well, thank you for starting it.
Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe.
Yeah, well, it was your...
Mr. Johnson. Mr. King. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Lankford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Capito, Cardin, Carper, Coons, Duckworth, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hirono, Kane, King, Leahy, Manchin, Menendez, Paul, Peters, Portman, Reed, Rosen, Schatz, Sinema, Tester, Warner, Whitehouse. Mr. Bennett, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Burr, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Crapo, Ernst, Fisher, Hoven, Johnson, Marshall, Sass, Scott of South Carolina, Tillis, Tuberville, Wicker. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Blunt, no. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Lujan, aye. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Rounds, no. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Padilla, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Warnock, aye. Do you? Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. McConnell, no. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mrs. Hyde Smith, no. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Markey, aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Cassidy, no. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Young, no. Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Romney, no. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Daines, no. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Haggerty, no. Mr. Merkley, aye. Two. Mr. Bozeman, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 51, the nays are 47. The nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's actions.
Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. Motion is agreed to.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider Calendar 340.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, the judiciary, Sarah A.L. Merriam of Connecticut to be United States District Judge for the District of Connecticut.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
Clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 340, Sarah A.L. Merriam of Connecticut to be United States District Judge for the District of Connecticut, signed by 17 senators as follows.
Consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I have a cloture motion at the desk.
Without objection, the clerk will report the motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the motion to concur in the House Amendment to S. 1301, an act to provide for the publication by the Secretary of Health and Human Services of physical activity recommendations for Americans and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators, as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that the mandatory quorum call for the cloture motions filed today, October 4th, be waived.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that S-Res 357 be star printed with the changes at the desk.
Without objection.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it adjourn until 10 a.m. tomorrow, Tuesday, October 5th, that following the prayer and the pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and morning business be closed, that upon the conclusion of morning business, the Senate proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the Adams-Allen nomination as provided under the previous order. Further, that the Senate recess following the cloture vote on the Adams-Allen nomination until 2:15 p.m. to allow for the weekly caucus meetings, that all post-closure debate time on the Adams-Allen nomination expire at 2:15. Finally, if any nominations are confirmed on Tuesday, the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's actions.
Without objection.
If there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.